Recording. I think we're ready to start. Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight for the launch of Escape from the Edge by Morris Schnitzler, published through the Azrieli Foundation's Holocaust Survivor Memoir Program. Although we are on Zoom tonight, many of our participants are here in Ottawa, which is where I am, and therefore I would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. My name is Deidre Butler, and I'm a professor in the religion program here at Carleton University and the director of the Max and Tessie Zelikovic Center for Jewish Studies. We are grateful to partner with the Azrieli Foundation, with Holocaust Education Week in Toronto, and our good friends at the Center for Holocaust Education and Scholarship. We gather tonight during Holocaust Education Month, that time when communities particularly direct our attention to the history and memory of the Holocaust. This time of year is historically meaningful, marking as it does the Night of Broken Glass, Kristallnacht. In history and memory, Kristallnacht stands out as a watershed moment in the history of the Shoah. Morris Schnitzler recalls how pivotal that moment was for his own family, along with so many other Jews, for the dawning understanding of what was to come. For Morris Schnitzler, as well as so many other children and adolescents, Kristallnacht also triggered the efforts that resulted in the Kindertransport. It seems particularly fitting to speak of his story tonight. Tonight's event is a double pleasure for all of us at the Zelikovic Center. Morris Schnitzler first published his memoir in 2002 as My Three Selves with the assistance of his wife, who first insisted that he share his extraordinary story. The Zelikovic Center hosted My Three Selves on our website for many, many years, where it remained as a key resource for students and researchers studying the Shoah. We thank the Azrieli Foundation for continuing to make this memoir available freely to our students and faculty. Please do reach out to us if you'd like a copy. If the first iteration of Morris Schnitzler's memoir, My Three Selves, was a labor of love, shepherded to publication through the support of his wife, tonight we are the beneficiaries of the labor of scholarship, which is also a labor of love for all of us tonight. Tonight's program frames Morris Schnitzler's memoir through historical scholarship and analysis against the history of the Shoah and the particular experience of the Kindertransports. Permit me to give you a preview of our plans for the evening. We will open our discussion with remarks from Matt Carrington and the Azrieli Foundation. We will then view a recording of our keynote by historian Professor Bob Moore, and this will be followed by a video testimony by Morris Schnitzler, and then we will hear from his daughter, Eve Schnitzler. I will then introduce Carleton PhD candidate Marie-Catherine Allard, who will speak about the Kindertransport. And we will wrap up our evening with a question and answer period. At this time, I'd like to invite Matt Carrington to introduce our first parts of the program.
Thank you, Dr. Butler, for that introduction. Well, my name is Matt Carrington, and I'm an editor at the Holocaust Survivor Memoirs Program. On behalf of the Azrieli Foundation, welcome to the launch of Morris Schnitzler's Escape from the Edge. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our partners, the Zelikovic Center for Jewish Studies at Carleton University, the Center for Holocaust Education and Scholarship in Ottawa, and the Neuberger Holocaust Education Center in Toronto. This event is part of Holocaust Education Week, organized by the Neuberger Holocaust Education Center of UJA Federation of Greater Toronto. And we at the Azrieli Foundation are proud to be the presenting sponsor of HEW 2021. This year's theme is Holocaust, Distortion, Myth, and Misinformation. Just 76 years since liberation, a new challenge threatens the memory of the Holocaust. Spread instantly via social media and normalized through pop culture, the surge of Holocaust distortion, myths, and misinformation has become increasingly common and dangerous. Protecting the facts, countering falsehoods, and safeguarding the memory of the Holocaust is at the core of HEW 2021. Check out holocausteducationweek.com for more information. Since 2005, the Holocaust Survivor Memoirs Program has been collecting memoirs written by survivors who made their way to Canada after the war. After fact-checking and editing, we published the memoirs in English and later in French. All of our books are made free of charge to schools and universities across Canada and are also for sale globally for everyone. Our education team works in every province and territory, both virtually and in person, to support and train teachers to take on the enormous task of teaching today's youth about the Holocaust. We train teachers to understand the power of memoir, the power of approaching history one story at a time. And tonight, we launch Escape from the Edge. With this, we have now published the stories of 120 survivors. Each of these stories recount the unique experiences of individuals and the people they encountered in particular places during the Holocaust and its aftermath. And it's these individual stories that must be told if we are to know the event that was the Holocaust. I have edited many Holocaust survivor memoirs with the Foundation, and of course, they're each of them unique, but none of them contain all the elements, the broad and captivating story that mark Morris's narrative as exceptional among the exceptional. You'll be hearing tonight about his story in detail, so I won't go into that now. I won't tell you about what it meant to be a Jewish boy in Germany in the 1930s, about witnessing and being arrested during Kristallnacht and then luckily escaping Germany by a kinder transport, but less fortunately not escaping the continent and staying in the Netherlands. I won't tell you about his time on Hashara, this kibbutz-like training with the Zionist organization, his journeys through almost all of Western Europe, looking for asylum and never finding it, being jailed even with his false IDs, finding revenge, first by joining a resistance movement in Belgium, and later by joining the American army as they headed towards Berlin. I can tell you that it was an incredible memoir to edit and to research. All of our memoirs are thoroughly fact-checked so that we can stand by their stories as personal but true recounting of this history. But they don't all include getting in touch with the one expert on the war period in a particular region in southern France to make sure Morris's remembered descriptions of the scene looking on a church window past the jail and towards the demarcation line with the free zone and his imagined freedom on the other side are as accurate as possible. I hope you'll enjoy the maps we created as well, one of which shows the details of Morris's journey with swirling arrows marking his movement, something we had never tried doing before and which helps us visualize Morris's steps across the continent through the war years. Because of the pandemic and his passing during the editing process, I never had the honor of meeting Morris in person, but I also feel like I did meet him through the almost year I spent working on his memoir. And I'm glad now you will all get to meet him as well through this book and this event. We are thrilled that this incredible, riveting book is now out in the world and being celebrated today, that it's being read in a large book club, that it's getting into all of your hands. Sharing Morris's story doesn't stop with this book. We have also recorded his memoir as an audiobook, which is narrated by the actor Jake Epstein. And we are in the process of producing a short animated film, which really looks like it's going to be great, as well as creating an upcoming educational activity, which will be provided to Canadian classrooms so students can embrace Morris's book. We are fortunate to have a keynote speaker tonight by Professor Bob Moore, Professor Emeritus at the University of Sheffield in the UK, whose renowned scholarly expertise is not only the Holocaust, but the Holocaust in the Netherlands. He knows Morris's book well. He wrote the book's introduction. Following the keynote, we will view Morris's video testimony and proceed with the program.
Ladies and gentlemen, it was a great privilege to be asked to write the introduction to Morris Schnitzer's wartime memoir, and an honour to be asked to speak at this book launch. The memoir itself has a narrative tension, broken only by the fact that we know that Morris survived the war and was subsequently able to write about his experiences. If there is a theme to this book, it is of the luck that Morris himself credits as having ensured his survival. But that is only part of the story, as the proactive choices he made during his odyssey through Western Europe were undoubtedly also a major contributory factor. A mixture then of circumstance, fortune, and human agency. But perhaps more generally, his story also reflects the experiences of many other fugitive Jews, looking initially for an escape out of German-occupied Europe, but ultimately settling for life in hiding until the liberation was at hand. Morris begins his story by describing his family's history as immigrants from Eastern Europe and his childhood growing up in an Orthodox household, not in one of the major cities that were the centres of Jewish life in Weimar Germany, but in a provincial industrial town of Wattenscheid in the Ruhr. Although the family business was apparently unaffected by early anti-Semitic measures, the pressures soon caught up with Morris when he was forced out of the local gymnasium and had to join his younger brother in a similar institution, but this time in Berlin. Like so many other Jewish families, it was the so-called Reichskristallnacht in 1938, the Night of Broken Glass, which proved to be the watershed, when thousands of Jewish male breadwinners were arrested and their livelihood shattered through violence, expropriation, and theft. Morris's first major choice was not, in fact, made by himself, but by his parents. And it was to have him included in the so-called Kindertransport program that took children and adolescents out of Germany to other supposedly safer countries in Europe. It's a very famous scheme which has been much written about over the last 20 or 30 years and ensured the survival of many thousands of Jewish children given up by their parents in both Germany and Austria and taken primarily to Britain, but also to other Western European countries. And Morris was one of a much smaller number of such children sent to the Netherlands. Because of his age, and by this stage Morris was more of an adolescent than a child, the Dutch authorities treated him as an adult and interned him initially, only latterly allowing him to attend the Zionist training farm at Veringermeer. This was a training farm designed to inculcate agricultural skills in young Jewish volunteers with the opportunities or potential opportunities for emigration to Palestine at some point in the future. However, the indifference and sometimes hostile attitude that Morris experienced in the Netherlands in his 2-year stay there was to be repeated when he returned there after the liberation. His second choice, a more direct choice if you like, was to see the writing on the wall in the occupied Netherlands in 1941, with increasing measures being taken against the Jews and the first arrests of Jewish young men in Amsterdam. Being aware of this, he and a colleague attempted to escape southwards through Belgium into France in order to try and reach neutral Switzerland. Here, his experiences mirror so many others who attempted the same journey. Of difficulties crossing frontiers, of unreliable and sometimes venal passeurs, the people who trafficked people across national boundaries, and of many trial and error attempts, any one of which might have ended in disaster. Nevertheless, in Belgium, he was able to obtain identity documents that effectively masked his Jewish origins, so that when he finally fell into the hands of the Germans while trying to cross the line of demarcation in France, his true identity remained a secret. Treated purely as a criminal rather than as a fugitive Jew, he was returned to Belgium to serve a 3-month sentence in the infamous Saint-Gilles prison. On his release, he was effectively homeless and friendless in a strange city and a strange country. Tracking down help proved difficult, but he ostensibly then made a positive choice not to lie low, but to engage in active armed resistance against the Nazis, and spent several months as part of the so-called Witte Brigade group, which was one of the major resistance groups in and around Brussels. Only when circumstances became too difficult did he go fully underground, passing himself off as an agricultural labourer and effectively hiding in plain sight, working for farmers and smallholders. Here again, his story shows how many of the binary explanations for those who sheltered Jews on the run failed to do justice to the many faceted motivations involved. In effect, he stayed in rural areas, working on farms until the liberation. But his experiences as a displaced person in the post-war era also mirror those of many other survivors, of bureaucratic indifference and sometimes outright hostility and shades of anti-Semitism. All in all, this book is not only a good read, but also an important testimony that helps us understand the vagaries and many facets of Jewish survival in Western Europe during the Holocaust period. Thank you very much.
We're now going to hear from Eve Schnitzer, Morris Schnitzer's daughter. Thank you, Eve.
Hello. My father wanted always to tell his story and that of his family. He didn't shy away from the telling, as some survivors of horrors do. When I was very young, he used to tell me bedtime stories, just as he did the sons of Monsieur de Givre, the last farmer he worked for, in Fexlo-Clocher in Belgium. He told silly stories sometimes, and old German tales, but he also started to tell me some of his stories of growing up and then of leaving home and going through the war. He especially enjoyed talking about the Riley funny incidents, falling into ice-cold ditches in Friesland, or his amazing escapes and how stupid the Nazi soldiers could be, or finally letting himself go at the end of the war and kicking a suspected Nazi down the stairs. As I said in the afterword to his book, I feel that he always held on to a sense of the absolute absurdity of the madness that unfolded around him, that somewhere deep down, he was always in touch with his true self, despite having to pass for a humble farmhand. Of course, as I got a bit older, I heard more stories, and they became more and more grim and frightening, and sometimes angry. He would often get angry at the way people had tried to fool themselves and play along with the Nazis and local collaborating authorities. One thing that's most painfully obvious to me from rereading the book now is how weak we humans can be. How so many of us want to go along with the crowd, first just to fit in and perhaps take advantage of any gains to be had, whether material or social or egocentric. And then as things deteriorate, how terribly strong the fear of punishment and death can be, of course. Throughout the story, my father and his few friends are moving through a surreal landscape of cowering individuals and collaborationist groups until the very end, when suddenly the heavy veil is lifted and people begin to act like so-called human beings again. But he always used to say that you never know how you yourself might react under such dire circumstances. He started writing down his stories on my mother's instigation sometime in the late 1970s, when I was far away and involved with my own life in Barcelona. She tried to find a publisher for his book, but at the time there wasn't much interest in such stories, it seemed, or perhaps she didn't know how to go about it. It was finally published in 2002 in Toronto by a small firm, but never properly edited or promoted, though my father spoke several times in Ottawa about it. But it really needed more thorough editing. He was a wonderful speaker and oral storyteller, but not formal writer, except in science, of course. And the Azrieli Foundation has made the book more fluid and well presented, and is finally getting it out to the world. In 1981, he and my mother had retraced his steps from the time he left home on the Kindertransport for Holland through so many places in France, Belgium, and into Switzerland, where he had the opportunity to be interviewed at some length on a popular French language TV program, thanks to his Swiss colleague, Jean Nehru, with whom he was very close. And finally, not long after my father's death last year, Monsieur Nehru managed to get the printed record of my father's arrest and expulsion after much evasion and delay by Swiss bureaucrats and dogged persistence on his part. My father certainly had some very devoted colleagues who cared very much for him. During that trip in 1981, my parents also went back to his hometown of Wattenscheid, as he tells at the end of the book. He gradually reestablished contact with Germans and Germany, beginning with German scientists who always made much of him and his research at international conferences, and finally with the country itself. However, when he was offered research positions at labs in Germany, no matter how good, he always turned them down, which I completely understood. I should mention here that one thing I did find strange, but certainly indicative of the trauma they suffered, was the fact that he and his brother Eddie always spoke English to each other, with perhaps some Yiddish, but never German. Imagine what that means, to be so deeply deprived of your mother tongue. He claimed to regret not moving to Israel later in life, saying the timing was never right, but I suspect he'd also had enough of violence and war, so his feelings were quite mixed. As for his relationship with Judaism, it was not so much religious as cultural and philosophical, but in those senses, it was very deep and strong. When he died, I received so many messages from people around the world who knew him as a brilliant and generous teacher and colleague. One was from a Dr. Frimmel, a scientist in Germany who said they had first met at a conference in the US, and my father introduced himself in German as not a German hater. Then, of course, he had to explain himself, and that man and his wife ended up in tears. Dr. Frimmel told me that some years later in 1987, he had great difficulty convincing my father to be part of a major conference on his particular area of research, humic acids, to be held in Berlin. But finally, my father did agree to go. One day he slipped away and then told Dr. Frimmel that he'd gone to see his old gymnasium and admitted that he was grateful for what he'd learned there from those excellent teachers. In fact, he always stood up for German education for as long as I can remember. He was open about his background with the Germans he met professionally, and he took to those who were open with him and expressed their deep sorrow at what had happened to him and his family and the millions of others. One of the scientists he became good friends with was Dr. Schulten, a younger man whose parents were confirmed Nazis. Dr. Schulten suffered great psychological damage as a result of that grim personal history, and he didn't hesitate to speak to my father about it. They were an odd pair, very close. I liked seeing my father recover his German self, though he always spoke with a heavy accent in English, and you really couldn't forget where he was from. But I felt it was good for him to recover that side of himself, to reoccupy his Germanness, which the Nazis had tried to take away from him. Finally, I want to say it was very important for me that my son was able to get to know him well, to hear his stories firsthand and spend time with his very special grandfather, who was such a wise, generous, and humble person. It meant a great deal to my father to know that his book was coming out in a new, improved form and would be distributed to schools and read by young people. He was able to meet several people from the Azrieli Foundation to be interviewed and filmed for posterity. But he never got to see the book itself, where he and his story live on. Thank you on his behalf.
Thank you so much, Eve. We're now going to watch some of your father's video testimony that we put together recently, but was recorded in the summer of 2019. If that could be played now.
My name is Maurice Schnitzer. I was born on February 4th, 1922 in Bochum, Germany. I remember in my class I was the only Jewish boy, and I was blonde and I had blonde hair, didn't look Jewish, and my classmates said, "You're not a Jew, you don't look like a Jew, you don't have a crooked nose and you don't have black hair." At the beginning, they had kind of I was quite friendly with them and so on. We were all classmates, and we had the spirit of being together and growing up together and being good Germans and all this stuff. And after a while, it became clear to them that it didn't apply to me, that I was different. But I couldn't really see that I was different. I looked like a nice guy. And there was a discrepancy there between what the politicians were telling them and what they saw with their own eyes. But unfortunately, this type of view didn't last very long, and they slowly forgot what they had seen before, and they became Nazis, they became anti-Semites, they hated me, and I had to leave the school. I couldn't stay there anymore. And then one day on Kristallnacht, we got a telephone call from my mother, and we were really shocked, and she said, "Come home immediately. All the buildings, all our stores have been, the glass has been broken. Kristallnacht is what they call it, Kristallnacht. And the stores have been plundered. Your father has been arrested in a concentration camp. Come home immediately." We came home and we saw the catastrophe there, and as we sat down, the Gestapo came in and they arrested my brother and me, and that's how we ended up in jail right on the same day. So after 2 weeks, my brother was a year younger, only 15. He was released, but I was 16. I was already, in their eyes, a man. So I had to wait to be sent to a concentration camp, unless I could get out of Germany within a week. So my mother, who was still free, but she was running around to all possible, to different places to try to get me out of Germany. And she finally succeeded in getting me a spot on a Kindertransport to Holland. And 3 days later, I left Germany, never to come back, never to see my parents, never to see anybody. But before I left, My father came back from the concentration camp. It was on a Thursday, I remember that, and he told me, he said to me, son, you're leaving tomorrow, and I give you one message. Never surrender to the Germans. Never allow yourself to get into a concentration camp, because that'll be the end of you. And you are only 16 years old, you still got the whole life ahead of you, so do whatever you can to keep alive. I ended up in Holland, and it was only just very close across the border. But I had 1 year and a half, I lived in a free country, and then the Germans entered Holland, and I was back under Hitler again. During the Holocaust years, starting with 1938, which was the beginning of the Holocaust for us in Germany, until the end of the war, about 1944, I was under constant danger, and I made up my mind not to surrender to the Germans. But I didn't feel like that I should die at the age of 20. That was too young, I barely lived. So I thought, I'm going to put up a resistance. I'm not going to surrender, I'm going to fight it out. And then one day the door opened, and then he said, you are free. Du bist frei, he said to me. I can't believe it. I couldn't believe that they would let a Jew go in 1942 in Belgium and in the German occupied area. I thought maybe the war is still continuing. I like to fight. You know, I want to really go into the army to do something really important, you know. But I remember having this feeling of absolutely fearless. I felt like a free man all of a sudden. I saw my parents in Kristallnacht the last time. I tried to find out from the German authorities what happened. They only say they were deported to the east, but I suspect they were killed in Auschwitz. I hadn't studied for 9 years. 9 years I was a laborer. I was a refugee, I was working with cows and agriculture and so on. I started at McGill, and I really felt that I was really good in chemistry and that I should go where I was good at. And so I got my BSc, MSc, PhD. I did it all in 7 years. I got a job at the Department of Agriculture. I never left there. I spent 63 years there. But I really loved chemistry. It was really like paradise, you know. And I was really good at it. I wrote 400 scientific papers. I wrote 3 books in chemistry. I really something special. But everything comes to an end. A Sophler call, there's an end to everything. So now I'm getting close to the end. I did what I could, and that's it. I got no regrets. My advice is the same as it always was. Don't give up hope. Always keep on hoping and fight for what is right. Don't give up. Fight, 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 fight. That's what life is. It really is.
Thank you. That was so important to hear those words after hearing you speak, Eve. You really gave context to that. In a world where Holocaust denial is an ongoing assault on the history of the Holocaust, scholars must support the voices of survivors and add their historical research and analysis to make clear that survivor histories are in fact part of our history. We are seeing this tonight through the work of the Azrieli Foundation's Holocaust Survivors Memoir Project, the collaboration of Professor Moore, and we're about to hear it in the work of Ms. Marie-Catherine Allard, PhD candidate in cultural mediations at Carleton University. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce Ms. Allard, as she is not only a gifted researcher, she has also, over the last year, become a true colleague to me, as she is working with me as project coordinator of the Hear Our Voices Holocaust Survivors Share Their Stories of Trauma and Hate project. I am the lead researcher for this project, funded by eCampus Ontario, that brings together scholars and student researchers from 5 universities, as well as partners from across Canada, including the Montreal Holocaust Museum, the Ottawa Jewish Archive, and the Azrieli Foundation. We have been interviewing survivors, members of the second generation, and righteous Gentiles in order to create online educational modules that place the voices of survivor oral histories at the center of teaching and learning about the Holocaust. As I reread Morris Schnitzer's memoir this week, I was struck by the parallels and differences we heard in an interview with someone from our project, Joseph Eisinger, who also survived through the Kindertransport, but whose journey instead took him first to Britain and also saw him traveling to Canada, where he was interned in multiple camps. Marie-Catherine Allard brought Joseph's story to me and the Hear Our Voices project through her doctoral research on the Kindertransport. I would like to welcome her now to reflect on Morris Schnitzer's extraordinary experiences in light of the Kindertransport and her research.
Hello, my name is Mary Catherine, as Dr. Butler has mentioned, and I am a PhD candidate in cultural mediation at Carleton, and as she mentioned, the project coordinator of Hear Our Voices, which is a bilingual online course directed by Dr. Butler that places the voices of Holocaust survivors at the center of learning about the Holocaust and anti-Semitism. I'm currently writing my own dissertation on the narrative representation of the Kindertransport, in which I analyze the work of 3 Kinder who were evacuated to England: Karen Gershon, Ruth Barnett, and Joseph Eisinger. By using different approaches, such as focusing on gender, the separation of families, and transnational memory, I explore how the narrative written by Kindertransportee challenged the British national memory, which put forth for more than 50 years the Kindertransport as a rescue operation that gave to 10,000 children the opportunity to grow up in an atmosphere of decency and normality, to work, to play, to laugh, and be happy, and to assume their rightful heritage as free men and women. As you may already know, the Kindertransport is generally described as a rescue operation, which allowed, before the outbreak of World War II, for the relocation of 10,000 children at risk of deportation from Austria, Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Danzig, mainly to Great Britain. Since the first official Kindertransport left Berlin only a few weeks after the violent pogrom known as Kristallnacht inspired Great Britain to waive its immigration visa for unaccompanied minors, the Kindertransport has long been a symbol representing Britain as standing alone against Nazi Germany. For instance, in response to critical inquiries on refugee quota, Great Britain put forth her generosity by relying on the Kindertransport to distance itself from the countries that did not open their doors to European Jewry and to position its intervention as early as 1938. It is this celebratory narrative, which Dr. Carolyn Sharples described as a self-congratulatory one, which emphasizes British humanitarian traditions and offer a heroic tale of daring do on the eve of war, that came to be incorporated into British collective memory. Studies on the history, the memory, and the representation of the Kindertransport have also generally focused on Britain's role in offering a safe haven to vulnerable children and also on the Kinder's adaptation to their host country. In these work, the importance of other nations in the good operation and implementation of the Kindertransport is recognized, but the main focus is generally on Britain's role and on the Kinder's gratitude and redemptive story. Although such studies are essential in describing the Kindertransport as an operation composed of an international network, seldom do they address the potential of departing, transit, and arriving cities in challenging the British collective memory to move beyond this nationalized narrative. Placing Kinder's testimony at the center of the representation of the Kindertransport is beneficial in rethinking the history in transnational terms and not solely in British terms. Morris's memoir is a great example of a narrative that creates a shift in perspective. Although it describes the importance of Britain in his brother's journey from Germany to England, Morris's narrative also includes his brother's internment in Canada, as well as his own Kindertransport experience in the Netherlands. Two stories that normally fall outside of the traditional Kindertransport narrative. By sharing different memories of the Kindertransport, Morris's memoir does not deny the relevance of the British national narrative in the history of the Kindertransport. His memoir rather creates a change in the perspective by allowing memories involving other nations that were part of the Kinder's transnational journey to enter our collective consciousness and take a position in relation to the British national framework. His memoir therefore draws attention to lesser known Kindertransport histories and enable bridges between the distinct national memories to emerge. The following statement by the German historian and journalist Lili Meyer emphasizes the relevance of redefining the Kindertransport as not entirely a British operation. During her presentation on the French Kindertransport at the 2019 conference celebrating the 80th anniversary of the Kindertransport, Meyer commented on the number of unaccompanied children saved on the Kindertransport. She explained that when one counts all of the Kindertransports, we can say that a little over 15,000 unaccompanied minors were saved on a Kindertransport, which is considerably higher than the 10,000 children usually cited in connection with the British Kindertransport. Amongst those 10,000 children usually cited is Morris's brother, Eddie, while Morris is usually excluded from those numbers. He is part of those 5,000 unaccompanied minors who were evacuated to other European countries, including France, Sweden, and in Morris's case, the Netherlands. According to the researcher Miriam Kessing, 2,000 children came on the Kindertransport to the Netherlands. In 2008, Kessing decided to research her grandfather's life experience to write his biography. She remembered that a refugee boy named Uli Herzberg had lived with her grandparents in November 1939, and so she was intrigued and wanted to learn more. During her quest, she discovered that her grandparent had actually welcomed more than one of those boys in their home, and that the boys' documents said that they had arrived in the Netherlands through a Kindertransport. She explained that she looked everywhere to learn more about their story. She looked in the Netherlands, in the US, in England, in Israel, but nothing. This lack of information triggered further her research, and she has since been researching the Dutch Kindertransport. Kessing explains that in the Netherlands, almost nothing is known about this chapter of Holocaust history, and that it is the Kinder's testimonies that can help paint a picture of what happened. Morris's memoir paints this picture. His complex journey to safety addresses a context in which he and the Kinder who had found refuge in the Netherlands found themselves. It, for instance, informs us about the internment of older kinder upon their arrival in the Netherlands, since, as Morris explains, the Dutch had expected a transport of little children, and so they weren't really prepared for older teenage boys. In comparison to traditional Kindertransport narrative, Morris's memoir presents his complex survival journey, one that includes the city of Franeker, his life in hiding, passing as a civilian, his expulsion from Switzerland, and the Belgian resistance movement. His memoir also reminds us, in more general terms, of our privileged retrospective viewpoint. Oftentimes, stories about the Kindertransport presents the parents' decision as equating to the survival of 10,000 children. Although the parents were essential in both taking this decision and in the good operation of the Kindertransport, when waving goodbye to their departing children, the parent could only hope that their children would be safe. They could not know, as we do in retrospect, that combined, their individual effort meant the survival of 10,000 children. In his memoir, Morris depicts this troubled immigration context. He explains that after his arrest, his mother found a place for him on one of the Kindertransport to the Netherlands, since all other immigration options had been exhausted. His Kindertransport and refugee experience also proved that nothing guaranteed his mother that her decision to send him on a Kindertransport meant that he would be safe. By mentioning the fate of his brothers, Morris also draws attention to the experience of the children who stayed behind, like Benno, and the children who were sent to England, like Eddie. Narrative that address the experience of the kinder who, like Eddie, his brother, were evacuated to England and were then deported to the British Dominion also contribute to the shift in the understanding of this rescue operation in transnational terms. By mentioning his brother's evacuation to England and his subsequent deportation to Canada, Morris also briefly directs his reader's attention to the under-discussed internment of older kinder deemed enemy alien, rather than solely on Britain's generosity. In May 1939, his brother Eddie arrived in England. A month after, Britain declared war on Germany and the last Kindertransport arrived in London. Quickly after, Britain began classifying her foreigner depending on their potential at enduring the war effort. There were 3 categories. It divided the foreigners as follows: Class A, B, and C. Foreigners classified as A were deemed dangerous, while Class B, aliens, were deemed friendly, and Class C were termed friendly aliens and refugees from Nazi oppression. The mounting fears that foreigners from nations at war with Britain would carry out Germany's plans from within in the event of an invasion pushed Britain to intern German-speaking refugees regardless of their classification and send them on a dangerous transatlantic journey to Canada and Australia. This included a number of older male Kindertransportees, including Eddie. Because immigration was essentially understood as a means to support Canada's economy by enabling skilled individuals to settle in Canada, only 5,000 Jewish applicants qualified under the Canadian immigration law from 1933 to 1939, meaning that almost no Jewish refugee qualified for immigration. And so it is Eddie's status as an enemy alien rather than his status as a refugee from Nazi oppression that enabled him to immigrate to Canada. At a time when the Jewish population caught in Nazi-occupied territories sought asylum, Eddie and his fellow Jewish refugee became Canada's accidental immigrant, where none was too many. By addressing his brother's complex journey, Morris adds layers to the British and Canadian narrative by drawing attention to the paradoxical and under-discussed accidental admission of Jewish refugees when Canada opens its door to British enemy aliens. This aspect of Morris's memoir contributes to contemporary discourses on national memory and on refugees and forced migration. Through the description of his complex journey towards safety, Morris challenged the traditional British narrative on the Kindertransport. His Kindertransport and refugee experience adds new layers to this history. By sharing his testimony through his memoir, Morris draws attention to the Kinder whose Kindertransport experience is generally disregarded, as they were sent to the Netherlands and not to England. As such, Escape from the Edge contributes to the shift in the understanding of this rescue operation in transnational terms. Thank you.
Thank you, Marie-Catherine. As a researcher, I began my career at Carleton interviewing Holocaust survivors and teaching about the Holocaust in my Jewish studies courses. It's difficult to appreciate today how long it took for survivors to be listened to. Yes, it took time for them to be ready to speak, but it took decades for the world at large to begin to truly listen. Early Holocaust historiography, that is the writing of history, hesitated to accept survivor accounts for the purposes of writing histories of the Holocaust. Ironically, they trusted the records of the perpetrators, which they assumed were meticulous and objective. Two descriptions which we know now to be grotesquely inaccurate. We now know that records were often used to reinforce Nazi propaganda, curry favor, and avoid reprisals. As important as they are, they too must be read critically and carefully by scholars to evaluate. It took survivors speaking out and scholars taking their words seriously to appreciate how important their voices were and are. Today, we have the opportunity to hear some of the last testimony from the war years. Child survivors and those from the second generation struggle to step into the breach so that the memory of the Holocaust is not lost to silence. In doing this work of speaking, listening, remembering, we resist together, as modern Jewish philosopher Emil Fackenheim argues, the concentrationary world. What is the concentrationary world? It is a world in which concentration camps are not only possible, but actual. A world that was steeped in the anti-Semitism that nurtured the final solution, where neighbors became bystanders and murderers. It is a world that is kept alive today by anti-Semitism, hatred, and Holocaust denial. We resist together by keeping these voices present and relevant through education and scholarship. I'd like to now open the floor to questions, and you can type your questions in the Q&A, the question and answer section. We're all here ready to answer and to engage in conversation with you. We have a first question that came early in the talk in the Q&A, which was actually a question to Yves. Could you tell us the name of your mother, his wife?
Her name was Leah Paultiel, and she was born and grew up in Montreal from a Romanian Jewish family.
Did you ever speak to your mom about how she felt about working on this memoir? Did you have a sense of what her attitude was?
Well, she just thought that it was, she always encouraged my father to talk, and well, he never hesitated. As I said, he from when I was very small, he started telling me stories one way or another. He didn't hesitate. Although I have to say, I also remember when I was small that the only time I heard him speak German was when he would shout out in his nightmares. But no, I know that she thought it was very important, and also, of course, went with him on that trip through revisiting all those places in 1981. And yeah, I'm sorry I didn't go with them.
Thank you. Is there anything in the memoir that you heard about that isn't included that you wish was there? Because you can't always include everything. Are there stories you remember that didn't end up making it into the final edit?
I don't think so. Nothing comes to mind. Certainly when I was reading it, I wasn't looking for something that I thought, oh, it's not there. It's not there. No. But it strikes me how little he spoke about his youngest brother a number of times, and that struck me, well, repeatedly. I think maybe that was just much too painful.
Of course. I'm keeping an eye out on the Q&A. Please, if you have a question, please type it there and I'll be more than happy to share it with our panelists. I thought I would actually offer a question to Matt. Matt, working on this project, I can tell was a labor of love, as we said earlier. What sticks out in your mind in terms of working on this project and this particular memoir?
You know what? I don't have an answer prepared for that, other than what I started off with, just what an incredible book it was, what an incredible experience it is to get to work on these kinds of books. Getting to work with Eve over email, we had some great back and forth. It felt like such a loss not to be able to work directly with Morris. It's just the timing of the process. But I think it was just an incredible book that, felt at times like an adventure story.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to realize that it's not an adventure story. It's an adventure for this young man in some ways. And in some moments, he sounds like he's having an adventure. And then you realize he's fleeing the Gestapo. He's fleeing, he's being rejected from Switzerland because of anti-Semitic tendencies happening there, where they won't even accept refugees in the country, and that, for him, that's life and death at any moment. And there is that on the level of story, there's that tension of just what is the plot, what is the exciting activity. There's he's joining a resistance movement and blowing up, having exciting adventures, and then the next moment the Nazis are there storming, raiding the house, and they're fleeing again, and he's off to try to pass on a farm again. It's a story that has so much and so many different moments and moods to it. There's a nostalgia looking back at his youth in Germany, and then there's each of the moments as he tries to figure out where he's going to go next, and as the world around him changes, right? So as an editor, you take that one scene at a time, and it was just I don't know if that gets to your question, but yeah, it was an incredible book to edit.
Thank you. And while you spoke, a flurry of questions came up. So now I have lots to share with you. The first one is how to get a copy of the book, which, as I understand, if you are an educator or a student, you can write to the Israeli Foundation and request it, either as a hard copy or as an ebook. If you're at Carleton University, please just write to us at the Zelikovic Center and we'll help you with that. If you're a member of the public, I understand it's available at Indigo. Is that correct, Matt? I got that right?
It's available wherever books are sold.
Okay.
Yeah. It's available on Indigo. It's available on Amazon. It's available. The best place to buy as you can is through our distributor, Second Story Press. So you can go to Second Story's website, because then you're buying it as direct as possible. With I like to support small bookstores if you can. But yeah, it's available everywhere, and the ebook is also available. There's also a PDF version, and there's an audiobook coming, which will all be available for purchase.
Fantastic. Thank you, Matt. So we've got a few comments and also some questions. So here we have a comment. I'm so glad that Eve's foreword from the original printing was kept. I found it very insightful and touching, the effect of her father's experiences on the next generation. And we have a thank you. This has been a marvelous and affecting event. Incredible to hear Eve live, and so affecting to hear Morris directly through the video. Wow. Here's another comment. They love the fact that you included maps. How does the book get distributed to schools? So I think we've just answered that actually educators and students can request it directly. But Matt, they're asking, does it come with teaching materials? So have you have those prepared for this particular edition?
As I mentioned in my introduction, we are preparing those teaching material lesson plans currently. We do that for many of our books, but not all of them. And we have a great one coming for this book. Yeah.
Thank you, Matt. So I've got a couple of questions and comments for Eve. So Eve, many survivors of extreme trauma like your dad went through don't talk about it and often don't share it even with those closest to them. Why do you think your dad was so willing to share his story, not just with his family, but more broadly as well?
I don't know. He was very tough and very, very smart. I mean, really brilliant. And he didn't want it to be, I don't know, and he didn't allow all these terrible things that happened to him to affect him psychologically. He used to say that so many survivors were half nuts. That was his tough expression. It was pretty awful, but he was obviously very affected, and there were ways that I think showed the trauma. Like I said, for example, not speaking German and not being able to at all for a long time, but then he did, which is why I thought it was so healthy for him to get back to his Germanness. But I don't know, he was just extremely tough, and you'll see that when you read the book, and a brilliant person, and he thought, I guess, that and he was a teacher.
Mm-hmm.
And he loved teaching, and he I guess he thought that it was important that these things be known, and we could see. I was, when I was teaching all kinds of refugees from terrible places, sometimes with terrible stories, when I came back to Canada, we would talk about some of these stories and the parallels and the repeated Holocausts of one kind or another in Congo or South Sudan or wherever it was, and they keep on, and so we need to talk about these things, and then he felt that too, and he understood that, and we need to see the parallels. And I think, Matt, that sort of thing needs to go into the teaching materials. Talk about what connected with other stories, other things that are happening in the world, and things that so many people in classrooms in Canada today from different places know about firsthand.
Sorry, the joy of Zooming. I've been Zoom bombed by my son. Sorry. So Eve, what you just mentioned, thank you, actually led into another question from one of our audience who asked about the Germanness that your father rediscovered. And we were hoping to hear a little bit more about that idea and what that meant to him.
He didn't really like to talk about it. I would push it more with him, I think. But he was a very German person. He had that discipline. He had tremendous knowledge of all sorts of aspects of, my God, he knew all about classical music and all these things that he had learned about in school in Germany before he was 16 years old, for heaven's sakes. His mother, he talks about in the book, I think, how much she loved German culture, and how much how hard it was for her to imagine that anything like the Holocaust or anything close to it could happen. They were living in the greatest country in the world, the most civilized, to use a strange word, to the best educated people with the best opportunities. All of that was very much inculcated in him.
Thank you, Eve. We have another question, this one from Marie-Catherine. What are some of the biggest challenges you've found? Sorry, I'm getting notices from Zoom. What are the biggest challenges you found while working with the oral testimony of Holocaust survivors as a research source?
That's actually a very good question. I would say that one of the biggest challenges I got was mostly trying to stay focused on so I need to say that most of the time when I analyze a work, I try to use a lens to see if it would work to analyze it with. So for instance, with Morris's memoir, I wanted to approach it with a transnational memories lens. And so when I read his memoir, when I watch the oral history, I want to talk about more subject. I see other lenses I could apply to analyze. And I think the hardest thing for me is to really say, no, we focus on this specific lens, see where it brings us, and then revisit the work if needed with another lens. So I would say it's really to stay focused, because there is so many different aspects that an oral history or a memoir can teach us. So thank you.
So Marie-Catherine, there's actually a follow-up question, which is to the academics. So I guess that's all of us in some sense. What is it that draws you to this area of research?
So actually, it was actually an article in that I read in one of my class. It was on a Holocaust narrative class. And it was an article from Sir Halfdub in Britain, who was talking about creating parallel or creating bridges between the Kindertransport and contemporary issues of forced migration. He was talking especially about the Syrian children. And so he was trying to see if we could create parallel to help those children. And I think that was this contemporary aspect of it that drew me in that scholarship. What about you, Deidre?
So I actually came to this subject through modern Jewish philosophy. I was an ethics and philosophy nerd as an undergraduate. And as I began to read Jewish philosophers' responses to the Shoah, many of them are rooted in kind of the stories from memoirs and from survivor testimony, some from Elie Wiesel, but certainly from other sources as well. And I became really interested in this history and in their voices and why those voices weren't used in history, but also the absence of women in how we philosophically respond to the Holocaust. So I'm still doing that, and then I get pulled in different ways. This particular project that you and I are working on is something that I felt was important because of where we are historically with so many survivors passing and the danger of losing their voices and their stories. And my own experience of listening to survivors and seeing my students listen to the survivors I've brought into my classes over the many years I've been teaching, and seeing the impact that they have on them. It's reading these memoirs, it's hearing their voices, it's seeing the video testimony that really impacts students and especially allows students to connect this history to the world they live in today. And so that's kind of where I am. Matt, did you want to throw in how you became interested in working with this research?
Well, I come to it as a literature academic and from an editing background. I come to it on the level of story first, which is quite different. We have historians on our staff, but I'm not a Holocaust historian, but I've been editing Holocaust memoirs now for over 5 years and fact checking each of them, which for me means going to the best sources or reaching out to scholars around the world or working with our in-house historian, and but not necessarily being that historian myself. But after 5 years of that work, you end up building a fair bit of expertise. And I think story is important. We learn through stories and through people, and it's important to bring that approach to how we engage with this history as well.
Thank you, Matt. We actually have a follow-up question to that, which is how did you validate the details of the story? So you've kind of pointed to that already, but is there anything you'd like to add?
Well, of course, not everything can be validated. You know, you can't validate every little detail or scene, but anything that's historical or which it can be in the public domain to be checked is what we can check. So anything in the public domain, which can be every sentence of some sections, and then other sections will be about personal views and stories, or don't have to be checked as much. But we check it against the best sources possible, and we have many scholars we work with, and are in-house historians, and then we have sources that we trust, and we go to those sources. But yeah, of course, we come across elements that we can't be checked, but as much as possible, which is almost all of it, is checked.
Thank you. We have another question, which I guess could be to Eva or to Matt, which is someone who's read the earlier memoir, My Three Lives, and just wondering, like, what's the difference between the two? So would either of you like to comment on how this Escape from the Edge is an evolution from that first iteration?
I would just like to say, as I think I said already, that really it flows so much better. It keeps my father's voice. It doesn't change a lot of wording, I don't think, but cleans things up somehow. The fact that a few pieces were moved around, probably more than a few, but I haven't studied the whole question. But and it has so headings for the chapters, and well, the maps, which was an idea that perhaps he would have done already, but I remember it was my father's very dear cousin in Tel Aviv who was insisting that there should be maps, and I'm sure they help a lot, and you see the sort of terrible circles he kept going in, and the photographs, of course, few as they were that I could find, but it flows beautifully, really does. Well done.
So we have a couple of education questions. So the first one is, in terms of Holocaust education, are there programs or approaches in other countries that come to mind that we in Canada should consider adopting? So I'm just wondering, Matt, do you have any connection to the Azrieli Foundation thinking about other countries or other ways of educating about the Holocaust from other national contexts?
So I'm not on the education team.
Okay.
That's not my focus. So I can't really speak to that. I know there's a lot of information on our website about our education approach. If people are interested, you should go there and check out the education side of the website. But it's not something I can speak to really.
Okay. Marie-Catherine, did you want to add anything about the way other countries handle Holocaust education? Otherwise, I can add something.
I can add a few words. I'm not sure if in Canada we already do it, but I did come across while studying the British Kindertransport that there are some apps that are being created to reach out to the younger public. And there's also VR experiences that are being created to also reach out to the larger public.
I would also add that I'm struck by the way every country that is committed to Holocaust education, because of course not every country is, seeks to find a way to connect to their own experience during the Second World War, but also anything contemporary as well, because everyone gladly understands that the way to inspire and educate young people is to make them understand that relevance. And so whenever you can do that, that's always an effective way. I also, on the subject of education, I have some warm thank yous to Eve from the book club that the Azrieli Foundation, Hillel, and Ottawa U were all involved in, and one of my students as well, several of my students were involved in as well, Hernan Tesler Mave, who's the co-coordinator of the VERID Center program at Ottawa U, wanted to express his thanks for everyone at Ottawa U. So thank you. To keep going, we have a few other questions, which is here. I'm going to ask this of Matt. This is, how did the Azrieli Foundation find out about Dr. Schnitzer's memoir, or did this come through Eve? Can either of you tell us?
Eve, can you speak to that? I know we received the book a few years ago.
It was friends of my father's. A number of different people. I don't know, Seymour Main, the poet from Ottawa U, and also another couple that was very close to my father that got to know him when he was at Hillel Lodge. I think they were the ones that that made the connection that this was a story that should be added to your series.
So we receive books from survivors and their manuscripts, and they come to our managing editor, Ariel Berger, makes the final choices about the publishing program and when we can slot in a book. We, in regular years, we'll publish 6 books a year, and I think it took a while, unfortunately, to get Morris's book into our program, but I wasn't part of the story of it coming to us.
Thank you. I know from my own experience that we often have people come to us at Carleton and we recommend that they approach the Azrieli Foundation. And I know the Azrieli Foundation is always looking for memoirs. So I think it's a back and forth process as well. I just had a very helpful comment actually from someone who notes that, the program that we're doing tonight makes it clear the ways that scholarship has advanced and how manuscripts are handled has advanced from when your father Eve first wrote that first memoir to what we're seeing tonight. And that leads me back to this question of fact checking. Matt, one of our members of our audience is asking if you could give us like a concrete example of a fact check. And if you can't, I know that Marie-Catherine can, because she does it all the time. So does anything come to mind?
Well, I mentioned one fact check where it was the view out the window of a church towards the jail and towards the demarcation line in southern France. The town's called Arbois near Besançon. And we contacted the scholar who is a specialist in that region, that town's history during the war, and talking about where the demarcation line was, where we would be, where he would actually be looking, and we had to adjust the description a bit because it wasn't quite accurate in the direction he would have been looking and where that line was and how far it would have been and whether there was a railway there. And it meant just in adjusting a few sentences, but it meant it was accurate to the history and to the geography, which is not something you could look up in a book easily, but you contact the right people and then you make the book as accurate as possible. And it's still Morris's voice, but now he's looking in the right direction. And there's no doubt that occurred, but it's also writing it decades after it occurred to him as a young man. Right? So.
That's wonderful. I know on our own project, we are interviewing the daughter of a woman who was on the St. Louis, and she talks about her mom's experience in the UK. And we found her mom on a census from the right town. So that would also be an example of fact checking. Marie-Catherine, can you think of anything from your own research that would illustrate fact checking that we do with these kinds of stories?
Yeah, sometimes, for instance, the kinder do not necessarily, because they were younger, they don't really remember exactly like how old they were, which year it was. So it's often good to go to the archive or even their school archive to verify what time they left, or really go into the archive to find these documents that can basically prove what age they were and help fill in the gap over there.
Thank you. We're right at the end, but we do have time for a couple more questions. We have one here that is actually about Indigenous scholarship and asking, do Indigenous scholars use Showa scholarship or research to study, learn, and teach about that genocide? What similarities and differences? So I know I can speak to that, but is there anyone else who wants to touch that one? No, it's in my hands. Okay. So it's a really interesting question because really for several decades, there has been a recognition among Indigenous communities and community leadership that there were important similarities between the experiences of Indigenous people and the experience of Holocaust survivors. Not to say that they're the same or equivalent. They're both very distinct, but there are important parallels that we can learn from each other's research and from each other's stories. So that's been an important part of how that scholarship has built, because as kind of people who study the Holocaust heard that from Indigenous people, that began to be studied and vice versa. I'll also say that there's quite a bit of research on trauma at the cognitive or psychological level and how that impacts our bodies and our brains. And so that research often targets both Holocaust survivors and their descendants and Indigenous survivors of residential schools and their descendants as well. So there's quite a bit of conversation that happens, and especially we see this around the Day of Reconciliation and Remembrance, which just happened here in Canada, and around Holocaust Remembrance Month, and also the date in January, that the conversation kind of ramps up again, and you see that connection between the communities. I have Indigenous students in my classes all of the time, and I know my students find it very valuable to look at this history and to learn how scholars and the Jewish community have responded to this history, because it's, you know, we're sadly further along in this scholarship, and they're still developing it. While it's rich, there's more still to do. That answers. I'm just looking at a few more of the questions. Here we go. Sorry, I'm just reading this. Eva, you're going to find this really quite beautiful and touching. My husband recorded his prayers at a synagogue we went to in Ottawa. Is anyone interested in his morning music in shul? That was from 1978 to 1981. We met in an elementary school, and my husband learned those prayers from Morris's voice and still sings them to this day. It's amazing. Eve, Morris had wanted to include more details about his life in Canada after he arrived and how he crafted a successful career about arriving here. Did more on that get included? So this must be someone who knew your father. Do you feel that more of that was included in the new memoir?
Honestly, I haven't sat down to compare one and the other. I think that I can't say to what extent Matt could tell us more about that.
I don't think Morris had a chance to add any more to that, but you know, this is why we asked Eve to write an afterword to talk about her family and what these stories meant, and to give some more sense of what's not said in the memoir about family life and what these stories meant. So that did get added, which wasn't in the. For those who aren't doing, I don't know if it's been said, but Eve wrote a great afterword, another voice that comes into the memoir about her father and this time. So that was added, which was significant.
Thank you, Kevin.
I think that it's very important to have that aspect, and I think it's quite clear in the book that the one of the astonishing things about his story is what an incredible career he made for himself afterwards. He just, as he said in that bit of video we saw, he never stopped. And yeah, he never stopped. He was working into his 90s. He said he thought he would die in the lab. He didn't, but I think he was always sorry.
Thank you. I'm going to circle back to the Indigenous question because we have an interesting comment in the questions, which says several years ago, the Azrieli Foundation held a dialogue between Holocaust survivor Nate Leipziger, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, and residential school survivor Thomas Fontaine. And they discussed parallels and differences between their respective experiences. And of course, Mr. Fontaine has spoken extensively on this subject. We are right at the end. So I guess the last question I would ask, and this is more to Matt and Eve, would be, it's been so wonderful to hear Eve tonight. And we know the importance of the family in allowing this memoir to come forward. So to Matt, I would ask, how often do you have really this rich resource of the family working with you? And what do you do when that's not there? And then Eve, I'm going to ask you one last question to close off our night.
So can you're asking what we do?
I'm asking you about families and the whole process of developing these memoirs. You've edited a few. Are families always part of it?
So if the survivor is the author is alive and active and able to work with me, then that's obviously the best way to go, right? It's one-on-one with the survivor, and there's often family intermediaries, and I worked on many where the author is not alive, and I've had great working relationships with the survivor's children. And sometimes there's tension as well when the survivor's children have a different vision for the book or understanding of the history than where we want to go. But in general, we always have somebody we're working with who, and it's, you know, through a thrill, and that can be the author. And yeah, it's usually the children who have a relationship with you and are answering all your very questions. But who is this person? Who is this family member? What was the relationship? Why did they spell their name this way here? Is that way there? Which one's correct? And they don't know because their mother wrote the book 20 years ago and is no longer around. But you know, that's part of the process of working on historical narratives.
Eve, just as a closing thought, one of the things that Marie-Catherine and I are doing is we're speaking to a lot of families of survivors, and we're speaking to survivors about how they tell their stories. And it's so difficult for families. I think in some way it's harder for the children to hear these stories than strangers, because it's your dad, it's your family. And I'm just wondering how you negotiated that as you tried to get this story out, but it's a deeply personal and intimate story for your family, and what you thought about that.
In terms of getting it out to the general public, not a problem. I thought it was important, and it's not ours to keep. It's something that the world needs to know, and people like, for example, residential school survivors. I've often thought myself, I remember talking to my father about that, about how, you know, if we were First Nations, and we would how damaged and hurt and so on we would feel. But it had to go out there. It was I think it was probably quite hard and had certain effects on me hearing some of these stories when I was very young. But now it's I'm just very glad it's out there and that it's so readable. Thank you to the foundation. Thank you to Matt for doing such a beautiful job.
Thank you. Thank you to your father, but also to your family for this gift. So lots of thank yous to go around. I want to thank all of our guests, our audience. You've asked wonderful, thought-provoking questions. And we hope that tonight's program was meaningful and that you will carry Morris Schnitzer's story with you to share with others. Please attend other events this month and this week for Holocaust Education Month and Holocaust Education Week. This is important material we need to learn and share. Thank you to everyone. Good night.